We're back from an extended Memorial Day weekend layoff, refreshed and ready to keep digging into the player report cards on today's episode of Locked On Bucks. And look, I think you asked for it, one of the most anticipated ones, a guy that really caught a lot of our attention last year, and that is A-Jax Jr. We get into A-Jax's rookie season and what to expect this upcoming season. All of that coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia. You can hear me on the Bucks Radio Network, joined by Camille Davis. You can find her on the Technical Foul podcast, on the Pack a Day podcast, on the Carry the G and MKE podcast, as well as we're in the midst of basketball offseason. Before you know it, Packer season is going to be here. And we both thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen or watch every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And as I mentioned, you can find us on YouTube as well, as some of you are currently doing on the live stream, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We continue our look back at some player report cards from last year, and Camille, coming off of that conversation that we had about a week ago with Ty of the Eurostep podcast, we spent a lot of time talking about young players, and with young players, there is one that we probably talked about the most last year, and that is who we're featuring today. And that is A-Jax Jr., who, if we just go back to draft night, I think we all saw the highlight clips. If you don't watch a lot of college basketball, I don't watch a ton. I knew the guy. I knew the name. I recognized, oh, yeah, that was the guy in the national championship team. I remember seeing some of his play throughout the tournament and in the national championship game. That was about it that I knew of A-Jax Jr., but you started to hear from others. And I know there's a couple of guys that I know that cover the draft and do draft prospectus, and reached out to them and thought, what do I take from this? Because one of these guys, I asked the same thing years ago about Dante DiVincenzo, and there was a lot of comps from Andre to Dante for played in the national championship game, played as a member of a very successful collegiate team for a number of years, coming in very ready. And he raved about him and said, this guy's going to be great. He's a perfect NBA player. He does all the little things, yada, 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 as we've seen through the years. Appears to be the case. And I think we saw a lot of that, but not all of it with Dante in Milwaukee. I got the same reports on A-Jax Jr. So from there, you're like, okay, let's see what this guy can do. Summer League, we started to see some of these plays. You're like, okay, all right. To me, it was really, I don't remember if it was their first, but that preseason game against the Chicago Bulls, where A-Jax Jr. comes in. The moment he's on the floor, there is a lot more energy, and the Bucks are running. But that stretch where he was defending DeMar DeRozan, and I think we talked about it on the show at the time too. Look, it's a preseason game. Right. When you're vets, you're like, hey, why is this guy trying so hard? We're trying not to get hurt and get ready for the preseason. So you add that caveat of, I don't know how invested DeMar was at scoring on that individual possession. But, man, you saw something there where A-Jax Jr.'s length and size, he stuck with him. He gave him some fits where you kind of filed that away and thought, okay, how much are we going to see this guy this year?
Yeah, it was something to get excited about. Like I've mentioned it time and time again when it comes to A-Jax Jr., but that's a guy who, under Mike Budenholzer, I do not think the Milwaukee Bucks draft because of everything you said about his game. That fits what Bud would look for, but the shooting aspect of it with A-Jax Jr. wasn't there. So when I started digging into his tape after the draft and everything like that and seeing more about him, like, wow, like he has a really interesting feel for the game. The defense stands out. All of the scouting reports talked about how he was strong at the rim, the athleticism, talked about his ability to guard possibly 1 through 4 in the NBA with his body size, mentions his intelligence as well, and just said like he can be a really like high floor role player for a team in the NBA. And that was what was exciting about him, and thinking about how he might be used different. And at that time, under Adrian Griffin, what we heard about the defense versatility and how he wanted to come out and attack things. So there was some excitement there about what he could do defensively. But watching Andre Jackson Jr., I mean, it's not as if he was shooting at a clip where it's like, whoa, scouts got that wrong. And it's not even as if he shot up the threes during his rookie year here. He only averaged 0.8 threes a game, but he shot 70 or 37% from those threes, which was a better clip than what I expected from Andre Jackson Jr., given all of the scouting reports about him coming out of college. And even looking at his college numbers, I mean, the man only averaged around that same amount of threes, 0.7 threes in his last year at UConn. He shot 28% from three. The year before that, he shot 36%, and then that dropped the following year. On 2.5 attempts this past year, his junior year in college, 1.8 attempts his sophomore year, where he shot 36% from three. So he was getting them up a little bit more frequently. Of course, that came with more playing time as well, but seeing the confidence that he shot with, just understanding role players in the NBA level, like if you're not a shooting threat at all, sometimes that shrinks your floor. And one thing that we saw with Andre Jackson Jr. this year as well was he's learning how to move off ball a little bit. He was more of an on ball guy in college as well. So just trying to figure that piece out. But also one thing that shocked me, and I'm looking for in his improvement next year, is just that finishing ability. There have been times where he does get to the rim, and instead of going up with it, he passes out of it. And I love a willing passer as much as the next person, but sometimes you just got to get the bucket.
His shot profile was basically two areas, as you kind of touched on at UConn too, and that's what we saw at the NBA level. But he was taking corner threes, and he was in the restricted area, which I think going forward, that's, I would assume, what you would tell Andre, if you're Doc and anybody else on staff, is look, when we talked about kind of balancing the disappointment with the optimism of what to look forward to next year, that's one of them, is not just the young guys, but this entire team to go through the offseason together, for Dame to know, hey, I'm a part of the Bucks. I know Giannis and Chris are going to be there, as we've touched on. I think Andre Jackson Jr., I think Brook Lopez, I think the rest of these guys, but I know this set of players that'll be there. I know how it worked last year. For the young guys, though, for Doc Rivers, as he himself mentioned throughout the year, I don't really see much of him. Like we only had so many practices. I'll see him in garbage time during some games, but this offseason is my chance to really see more of their game and work with them. I would assume that's where it starts, is, okay, here's the shot diet, Andre. Here are the things that we saw you do pretty well last year. Here's the things that we think you need some work on. But what we do think we have are corner threes and just your drives getting to the rim and the restricted area. Let's continue to work on those. That's where he was at his most efficient. Again, it's not a ton, so it's really tough to share some of the effective field goal numbers for Andre. He was surprised, very good around the rim, just under 80% there. 40% in one of the corners, 52% in the other. Again, you add, it's a very low volume of shots, but I think that's what stood out, is that's where he was most comfortable. We did see a handful of the above the break threes. Sometimes those went in, but it was clear, okay, the corner threes are the easiest. You referenced his shooting numbers in UConn. Let's start with those. Maybe we can expand from that point forward. But when you look at some other things, I think what kind of surprised me, there's a couple that surprised me for good and bad when we examine Andre's numbers. We'll get into the defense coming up in the second segment of the show, but offensively, he was at his best in creating the most points for the Bucks when he was on the floor as somebody that was driving to the basket, whether that meant finishing himself or doing a drive and kick. And the other one was, which was his most efficient, and when he created the most offense, was when he was basically the point guard and he was the ball handler in a two-man action in the pick and roll, created about 1.5 points per shot attempt in those situations. And just as we said with the three-point shooting, it's not a high volume, right? So that number's probably going to come down next year if you see it more. But that again is another piece where you just kind of pour over the numbers and say, okay, here's another one that we should look at and start with.
Yeah, that's impressive. Again, low volume, but it goes to show something that we knew about him at UConn, which was that he enjoys being on ball. Like he was even projected as being a secondary ball handler. And we've had conversations throughout the offseason so far about looking at this Bucks roster and some things that they might need. And it's another ball handler. So if that is something, and not saying that we're going to have like point guard Andre coming out or anything like that, but we've seen with the Bucks, like they use other guys to initiate the offense at times. They use Chris a lot for that. They use Giannis for that a lot. So it's not as if it's unusual for us to see the Bucks using non-traditional guys to initiate the offense. And that's something that could be something that's added on to Andre's plate. I'm not sure if that's added onto his plate as soon as next year. It might be more one of those things of trying to get him to be that ultimate role player, depending on what his role is going to be with the team. If he's going to get more minutes with the starting guys, then like that doesn't seem like a likely avenue for him to be trying to improve upon and really harp on. But if he's in bench units, depending on who else is around him, that could be something that you do if he has a comfort with the ball in his hand, as we saw at UConn. But just to rewind something that you mentioned as well with Summer League and things of that sort as well, it's always interesting seeing guys at Summer League because the role they're normally asked to play during those games is not the role that you're going to see them play in the regular season when the stars of the team come back around. So when it comes to Summer League with Andre Jackson Jr. this year, if he does play, which I would assume that he does, it'll be interesting to see the scoring ability and the comfort just when he's in positions to score, if he takes advantage of that or not, just given what you mentioned about the numbers that we've seen here, and as well as what our eyes saw throughout the regular season last year of him just passing up opportunities at times where it could be an easy bucket for the Bucks. And when you get a chance to have an easy bucket in the NBA, you want to try to get that.
Yeah, and how he evolves offensively, or at least how you harness some of those things that we referenced that he did pretty well, albeit small sample size. But how do you continue to work on that and just sprinkle in some other parts of it? That's going to really be the tell of what the Bucks have in Andre Jackson Jr. Because I think the defense, as we've touched on, is there. It's just a matter of the opposite conversation that we've had with players like Malik Beasley of, okay, you got to do something defensively. You can't be the worst defender out there. And for Andre, it's kind of similar in that, hey, you can't be the worst offensive player out there. But I think one of the safety nets that Andre has, which we'll get into in our next segment here, is, look, you got offense in a lot of other places on this team. So if you are that designated defender, that could go a long way in carving out some more minutes for Andre this upcoming season. I mentioned some of the defense. That's the word that we would place on Andre Jackson Jr. the most, or energy and athleticism and all that. But defense is what you think about with A-Jax. And there were some surprising numbers as we started to dig into his individual performance. So we'll get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Passion, drive, and patience. That's the winning formula for championships, and it is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay's Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, as we continue on here, Camille, I mentioned defense, and there were some numbers that really surprised me with Andre Jackson Jr., because that's what we assumed is, hey, I mean, this guy, you saw it with the eye test, right? We talked about the energy and just how the game seemed to slow down for him on the defensive side, taking the fouls out of it, as we've touched on and we've talked about with Frank. but that's where he really, really took to this. So when you dig into some of the numbers defensively, it surprised me in that didn't really tell the story of Andre Jackson Jr.'s rookie season. Now, I think there's a lot of caveats with this show because of the minutes played and everything else, and who those minutes were coming with for Andre Jackson Jr. So we'll state that first. But when we look at a number of things here for Andre, so first and foremost, I think a lot of us kind of kicked around, hey, what if you would have started Andre Jackson Jr. instead of Malik Beasley? We ultimately saw that go to Pat Beverly, a player that Doc Rivers very familiar with and comfortable with. But somebody playing that role, as Pat Beverly's out there for his defense, especially on the perimeter, whatever you get from him offensively, great. But you knew in those lineups, he's going to be the guy we're not going to rotate over from to help off of. He can take the open shot. We are going to. That's going to be the same with Andre Jackson Jr. in this lineup, and you accept that. So if we swapped out Andre Jackson Jr. for Malik Beasley or Pat Beverly in those instances, you saw a couple of things. So the starters, I should say, with Andre, so Dame, Chris, Giannis, Brook, and Andre Jackson Jr. We didn't see a lot of it. There were 60 possessions. The Bucks were a plus 22.9 in net rating in those. But that was basically all propped by the offense. It was a 136.7 offensive rating. Again, 60 possessions is not a lot. So that's the challenge with this. But hey, the offense was really good. You got four guys that you know can score. Andre's the guy that's out there that's going to defend. Your defense was not elite, but it was a 113.8, which would, for a full season be around a top 10 defense. So that to me was interesting of, okay, we didn't see a ton of it, but that kind of matches what I would assume, where your offense doesn't fall off because you have four other capable scorers and you got Andre Jackson Jr. to throw out there in some matchups. So I thought, okay, let's take a closer look at this. I don't want just numbers with Andre on the floor versus off, because a lot of those were garbage time, and he's playing with AJ Green and other players. So what about the minutes or lineups where it was Andre Jackson and Giannis on the floor at the same time? Because again, that was the one that we thought, okay, I wonder how he looks with him. And we talked about it during the preseason too, is man, Marjan and Andre Jackson Jr. are two guys that get out and run on the fast break. And you could almost tell at times Giannis would look up and think, holy cow, somebody else is running. It's not just me that's doing this. So how does he look in those minutes? Not good. Their net rating, this was 600 possessions, so a little better to gauge there. But their net rating was negative 1.5. Offense, again, very good, 123.7. But their defense dropped down to a 125.2 in those possessions, where it was Andre and Giannis on the floor, whoever else was around them. And I think the bigger piece of this is I mentioned one other name, and that is Marjan Beauchamp. When there's this clear connection between those guys, and I think the eye test would tell you, hey, best minutes that we saw for Andre for most of the season were when he was paired up with Marjan Beauchamp, that those two seem to have some type of connection, especially on the fast break. And again, that disclaimer, not a whole lot of possessions that we saw that. It was just under 200. It was not good by the numbers. It was a negative 9.9 net rating. Offense was a brutal 107.9, and the defense a 117.8, right around where the Bucks finished for the year as a whole. So I think the big takeaway is, look, can Andre Jackson Jr. play that role that we saw towards the end of the year that Pat Beverly took over? Is, again, that's a big, big piece here, is Pat Beverly is a free agent. I thought before the season ended, pretty good chance Pat Beverly was going to be back on a vet minimum if that's what he wanted. What happened in that final game and afterwards, who knows? That may cloud it a little bit, but that's still a TBD. But I think by the numbers, and again, not a whole lot of possessions that we got a chance to see that, but it does seem as though that's the blueprint. You got scoring around him. He's the guy that's out there that's taking on that perimeter matchup. And look, as we mentioned, Pat Beverly, still a good defender. He is by no means the Pat Beverly that we saw in Los Angeles and certainly Houston in those years. but he was the guy that you had to say, hey, Pat, we need you to take these tougher assignments. I think Andre, with a second year of seasoning, the one thing he has more athleticism at this point, but he's got a lot more size, which was the one thing that stood out. Is you can throw him on Halliburton, Pat Beverly here, but when you get to what if you get that series with the Celtics, when you got to contend with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, you're gonna throw Pat Beverly out there because that's all you have, but it's still going to be a size disadvantage, and that's the one area that Andre Jackson Jr. gives you, his athleticism on the perimeter, the fact that he's 6'6" and has a 6'11" wingspan.
Yeah, that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And I love that you mentioned Pat Beverly as well. We're not sure if he'll be back on the Bucks next year. In addition to what happened during the last game, Pat did say on his podcast, he's hoping to get a little bit more than a vet man. He feels he's earned a little bit more than that. So we'll see how those numbers shake out or what it is that he might be looking for. But one thing that stood out to me this season was that Andre Jackson Jr. became like Pat Bev's guy. Like he was somebody who Pat Bev verbally mentioned that he was spending a lot of time with and really trying to work with. And as we know in the NBA, it's all about your vets and who can kind of help impart that wisdom on you, how you receive that coaching, so on and so forth. And for that to be someone who Pat Bev was like, no, A-Jax, like I'm with him. Like that's my guy. I got him. Was really interesting to me, given the role that Pat Bev played on this team, and looking at Andre Jackson Jr., what he might be able to do as well. And even looking at the current playoff field and look at the Mavericks and how they reconstructed their roster over the last year and a half, really, for this team. And they have just some long defenders where you can throw out guys who are 6'6", 6'7", who might necessarily be known as like lockdown guys, like your Derrick Jones, where it's like he's going to bother you with his athleticism, with the way he can move his feet, and with his size, which sometimes is enough. And against the Celtics in itself, like that's a different proposition because those are bigger bodies you're trying to guard. But when you're thinking about what we saw some teams throw out, like Jalen Brunson down the stretch, where you're seeing Neesmith on him, just a bigger body to try to bother some of these guys who can get buckets. That's something that Andre Jackson Jr. could do as well along the way there. And for him, just looking at what he was doing this season, like you saw the effort, you saw the ability to move. For Andre, sometimes I felt like he was getting just a rookie whistle where it's like, I'm not sure if that was really a foul, but he doesn't have a reputation in the league yet about being a good defender. When you're a good defender, refs tend to give you a little bit more leeway because your reputation precedes you, and he has to earn that. But in addition to that, Andre Jackson Jr. defended with his body a lot instead of moving his feet. So that's something this offseason where I'm hoping to see that the lateral movement just gets a little bit cleaner for Andre, because we've seen him do it in stretches before. And you look at his college tape and he guarded 1 through 4 a lot at UConn. So it's not as if it's something that I don't think he can do. I think it's just he has to get used to the NBA whistle, how things are going to be called, getting used to what his competition is doing, and learn from that, because that's the key for Andre Jackson Jr. when you look at his scouting reports and everything of the such. It was around the fact that he is a great point of attack defender. And as we've mentioned, that's an area where the Bucks need some help. Because even if you look at the roster with the big three there, or you want to go core 4, including Brook Lopez, that fifth guy there, like as we've mentioned, you really want him to be somebody who can be a lockdown defender. Like you really need that point of attack defender. And if Andre Jackson Jr. can grow into that in a way where it's not consistent fouls, where he's able to move his feet, it just adds so much, especially if you start thinking about what it might look like if the Bucks want to go in a more small ball type of lineup next year. Not sure who that combo might be, but if we see some looks with Giannis at the 5, who else can you throw out there around him to have that really switchy, versatile defense? Andre Jackson Jr. is a name that I would think would be near the top of that list of a really interesting lineup next year with some more development behind it, because as you mentioned with this year and some of those numbers, they weren't as, good as you might have thought they would be, especially that Giannis and Andre pairing. But the hope is that next year, with another year of experience, he can grow from that.
Yeah, and I think one of the other interesting tidbits is you mentioned that Mavericks comparison, and especially how that team was put together. When you think about Derrick Jones Jr., you referenced, he was on a vet minimum, and Dante Exum was exiled from the NBA, comes back after playing, I think he was back in Australia, comes back here and he's been a big contributor. Josh Green, a young player and a draft pick. These are the guys that are sparking that change in that defense. Obviously, PJ Washington and Daniel
Right.
Gafford, big parts of that as well. But it wasn't necessarily blue chip guys that the Mavs brought in or huge trades that they made to round out that defense. And as you look at that and you think, okay, where do we have some of that? Obviously, the bigs is the issue that you need to tackle and say we need more size that can switch. Not necessarily the strength of Bobby Portis or Brook Lopez's game. So where else can you find that? That's going to be the big challenge this offseason. But looking at the rest and on the wing, could Andre Jackson Jr. or even Marjan Beauchamp be one of those guys where you think, man, this is a second-year player. Why didn't he do this last year? Those are the types of guys that think, hey, is this guy a rookie? When you're maybe not an everyday observer of the Bucks and learn, oh, Marjan's a 3-year pro, or Andre was here last year. And these guys went through the offseason with Doc, and now you have something there. That's the last thing I would point out in those lineups, as I mentioned, that comfort with Marjan. One other lineup that really stood out to me, and again, very, very limited run that we saw, just 32 possessions. But when you had Brook Lopez at center, Damian Lillard on the floor, and Giannis out there, and they were accompanied by Marjan Beauchamp and Andre Jackson Jr., the offense, very, very good. A 140 offensive rating. The defense was a 103. And again, 32 possessions that we saw that is far from a lot, but those are the types of things that we're talking about is, okay, Dame and Giannis, those guys can score. Brook is back there to clean anything up that beats the perimeter, but there's less of that when you have Marjan and Andre that are out there. And I think the fact that Dame and Giannis are as elite as they are offensively speaks to that 140 number in those limited possessions, because that's the challenge is, can you play two of those guys at the same time? Is the offense from Giannis and Dame going to be enough, or is this just a, hey, it's one of you that's going to get the crack, and we're going to have to figure out where to sprinkle that in? But I think the long and short of it is, look, there's a lot to like from Andre Jackson Jr., and now he's the guy that I think you would look at the most and say, okay, in an off season now where you know who your head coach is, you know what to expect from him, and you know, relatively speaking, your teammates and what your role was last year. But that coach also had you last year and gave you these are the things I need you to work on. What's the growth that we see from that point forward? Because just looking at just looking at Andre Jackson Jr.'s past here at UConn and what we saw this past year, there is nothing to make you think. And some of the things you mentioned too, from Pat Beverly talked about this, Dame Lillard talked about it, Chris Middleton as well, and Bobby. He is an incredibly hard worker. Even Doc talked about that. You know, Mars did it again. But Andre Jackson Jr. is one of the first guys in the building, and he is always the last to leave, working with coaches and going over things and trying to learn as much as he can. So that's another thing that I think really bodes well for his future beginning next season.
Yeah, I think so as well. And thinking about next season, just want to throw it back to you maybe after the next break, but just thinking about what his role might look like a bit more next year, because looking at some of his numbers in college too, just his first year there, of course, your freshman year is normally, unless you're, a one and done prospect, that's your learning curve of getting used to that particular level. And seeing what he did his freshman year and then the jump that he took his sophomore year and sustaining that in his junior year, just trying to think a bit about what that might look like at the NBA level for Andre next year when he comes back. Like, what might that jump for Andre look like? And honestly, the question is, what would a successful jump for Andre look like? Because I think that in itself is different than what the pie and the dream idea of Andre is.
Certainly one of the interesting things to get into is level setting expectations, right? We just pie in the sky. We referenced a lot of, hey, wouldn't this be great? But realistically, what can and should we expect from Andre Jackson Jr. in year number 2? So we'll get into that conversation. And to round things out on our look back at the rookie year of Andre Jackson Jr. after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and constantly have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting If so, it's time to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel, and it is programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Camille. Last year, Andre played in 57 games, which I think just starting there, I would not have pegged that many. If you put the over-under on how many games is Andre Jackson Jr. going to play, I think you probably would have started in around 30 and said, okay, a lot of it is going to be garbage time. As it was, we saw him starting early in the season when injuries were starting to pile up. But again, you saw some of those things. 57 seemed like a lot. So I think that's another one of those foundational pieces, the building blocks. A good thing is he got pretty experienced last year, only 10 minutes per game. But I referenced those 8 starts that he made, a lot of that early in the year. A lot of playing time, all things considered, for where you got him and what the realistic expectations had to be coming into this season, in a season where you just signed Malik Beasley, you had Damian Lillard, you had Chris Middleton, you already had Marjon Beauchamp and A.J. Green, who was just given a full contract on the roster. So I think that was the other question is, yeah, you lost some pieces. There was no Wesley Matthews. There was no Javon Carter, but I don't know where the minutes are going to come from. And we saw him get into 57 games.
Yeah. And then top of that, he played in 5 playoff games, and understand that the roster had the injury concerns with Giannis being out the entire series, with Dame missing some time. But the fact that Andre Jackson Jr. played in 5 playoff games this year, averaging about 12 minutes a game, like that's a valuable learning experience, as we talked about. Like throughout the regular season, we're always like, well, it's nice for these guys to get experience during the regular season, but let's see if they can actually crack a playoff rotation. And maybe out of desperation for the Bucks, Andre got in there, and he definitely made some impact during his time there as well. And getting that playoff taste, feeling how different that is from the regular season, understanding how important every possession is, that's invaluable experience for Andre right there. And I was looking at a couple of other guys, not saying they're direct comps to Andre Jackson Jr., but just some other guys who kind of came out into the NBA known being pretty good defender, but not necessarily a great scorer, like your Matisse Thybulle or your Isaac Okoro. And both of those guys got more playing time early on than did Andre Jackson Jr. in Milwaukee. But one thing that stands out to me, like with Isaac Okoro, who is somebody who you don't necessarily think of initially as a great shooter, like his rookie year in the NBA, he shot 29% from 3. He has shot no lower than 35% from 3 in his next 3 seasons thereafter. Matisse Thybulle is somebody who I think about a lot, who when coming in, they're like, he's not a great 3-point shooter. He had a great rookie year shooting the ball from 3, 36%. Then that dropped into the low 30s until he got traded from Philly with Coach Doc Rivers, as we Bucks fans are familiar with now, and then became a more consistent 3-point shooter as well along the way. So when I look at Andre's numbers and seeing the fact that he shot 33% from 3 in the playoffs, the fact that he shot 37% from 3 in the regular season, if he can keep it around that level of 35, 36% from 3 consistently, I think that's a good bar from him, way higher bar than I would have thought for him coming out of college. But if he can start being consistent with that, with more playing time, that's going to be big for him as well. We talked about, of course, the finishing around the rim and just his feel. I'm really curious to see how Doc Rivers uses Andre Jackson Jr. next year when he has more familiarity with his game, gets a chance to see him in camp, gets a chance to see him in summer league. If we do start seeing more of that secondary ball handler play come into part, because I mean, we saw Doc Rivers throw out point guard Pat Connaughton during stretches last year. So I do wonder as well if we see that more with Andre Jackson Jr. in some lineups. And then just thinking of what for him. So I mentioned the 3-point shooting, keep that 35% or higher next year. I'll consider that a win for Andre Jackson Jr. to say like, hey, me shooting at a 37% clip in my first year wasn't a fluke necessarily, but I'm not going to aim for 37% again next year, especially on a higher volume. So if he can hit that, that'll be big for him finishing around the rim. And honestly, looking at the minutes, like the fact that he averaged 10 minutes a game his rookie year, 15-ish, his next year, like somewhere in that area, I think that'll be good for Andre as well.
Yeah, and a couple of the names that we've already referenced on this show, that's the interesting part, is last year. I remember seeing this right around the time of the draft and pulling it up again in preparation for this show to just revisit that. But behind the Bucks pass, Dalton Snell put this piece together where after the Bucks got Andre, they did what is basically the dream scenario that he could become? What's the most realistic that you would think Andre would fit into in terms of role and player comps? And what's the floor? So at the very least, we think we're going to get this. The floor was Matisse Thybulle. I think there's probably a comp to be made here in the middle was a more defensive Dante DiVincenzo. And the dream scenario was if this guy could ultimately become what Andre Iguodala was for the Golden State Warriors, which, again, you see some traces of all three of those guys. He obviously would need to improve the shooting. Not that Andre Iguodala was a great shooter, but he was good enough. But you see hints of all three of those. And I do think Matisse Thybulle is a pretty good floor comp for him, as we've touched on throughout the course of the year. And you just mentioned before, too, that, look, if this is all he ultimately becomes, I think there would be some disappointment. But let's also keep in mind, Matisse Thybulle is a rotational player and a player that the Bucks and others were linked to and an interest in of, hey, we need guys that can defend on the perimeter. The importance is just how do you surround them when they're on the floor and what players do you have out there with them? So I think at the very least, what you do know is we have an NBA player. We have a rotational piece here in Andre Jackson Jr. and which direction he goes. Does he move past what Dante DiVincenzo was in Milwaukee? Maybe not ultimately what Dante DiVincenzo has become now for the New York Knicks, but can he get close to that level? Does he just stay at a Matisse Thybulle level? Because again, if so, fine, but at least it's still a big piece of your team. And that's the big takeaway for me was there was a lot of reason for optimism for Andre when you started to pour through the scouting reports and heard about, hey, he's got a winning mentality. The years that he played at UConn, being a part of the national championship team, he's used to it. He's one of those types of kids that puts in the work. So there's a lot to like there, and obviously the physical tools. And we saw all of that throughout the course of the season over those 57 games. And now it's a matter of, all right, does that 57 become 72, somewhere around that, or 82? And this is a guy that his minutes go from 10 to maybe 20, right? And those are the types of growth that we see from Andre Jackson Jr. this upcoming season. But that was my takeaway on him was it is still very much a work in progress. I think he, more than just about anybody else, maybe Marjan Beauchamp is in this category as well. Really tough to take any of those numbers that we threw out there as gospel because of who he was on the floor with and how limited they were. But what you saw, there's a lot to like from Andre Jackson Jr. moving forward.
It's a great way to sum it up, Justin. There is a lot to like from what you see with Andre Jackson Jr. And I'll end it with this. The Dante DiVincenzo comp and thinking about what he's become in New York. Part of what Dante has said that he credits to what helped him with the three-point shot in particular was the years he played with Golden State, with the Warriors, and being able to learn from Steph Curry. So I say this a lot to Bucks fans, like, we should never make that trade. Maybe we shouldn't have, but there's no telling if Dante's game would have evolved into the way that it has now if he did not have that stop in Golden State to learn firsthand from Steph Curry. I say that thinking about this particular Bucks roster and the fact they have a Damian Lillard on the roster. Now, I'm not saying Andre Jackson's about to come out here and be like this next sharp shooter, shooting from 35, 40 feet or anything like that, but when you have vets on your team that can really impart some training on you, that can give you tips and tricks of the trade, that goes a long way. And the fact that, Dame is here with the shooting, I think about AJ Green a little bit more with that. But just thinking of the vets around Andre Jackson Jr. right now and what they might be able to do for his game over this season or over this summer going into the next season as well, I'm really excited to see what that might look like for him.
Yeah, and again, how you incorporate him with Marjan Beauchamp, another guy that we shouldn't let get lost in the shuffle, as we touched on a number of times. What Doc Rivers had to say at the end of the season, and again, as we made that reference to the Dallas Mavericks, look at how they rounded out that roster. It's not just trading for Kyrie and getting Derek Lively in the lottery. It was more than that, or the trades for PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford. It was some of those other younger guys that really started to expand their game and just get more reps and experience. So that is one area that you can heavily lean on this next season if you are the Bucks, with a handful of those guys. AJ, we talked about, Marjan, and of course today's focus of the episode, Andre Jackson Jr. So we have some more of these to continue to go through. We're going to take a look at Brook Lopez's season in a couple of days here on Locked On Bucks. A reminder too to cast your votes for what the focus of this Friday's Flashback Friday episode should be. Right now, not totally surprised by this. The trade that netted the Bucks Brandon Knight and some other guy named Chris Middleton is the leader. The 2001-2002 season, not too far behind, which was a very interesting one. So I have a feeling we're going to dig into that one at some point this summer. But it seems as though, based on the first poll, I believe the Jennings Knight trade finished second behind Bud, and now running away with it thus far. Seems as though there's a lot of interest in revisiting that trade that brought the Bucks a franchise legend and Brandon Knight at the expense of Brandon Jennings. Tomorrow, by the way, we are going to be joined by Gabe Stoltz of Brew Hoop to continue to take a look back at last season, get his thoughts on the offseason and more. So that'll be our interview episode on tomorrow's show. And then Brook Lopez will take a look at that season on Thursday, as we reference the Flashback Friday show in your hands for Friday. One other thing I do want to point out as we wrap up here, Camille, and that was the sad passing of one of my all-time favorites for a number of reasons, but the passing of Bill Walton yesterday on Memorial Day. He was one of my all-time favorite figures in basketball. I know he was not beloved by a lot of Bucks fans dating back to the NBC days and that playoff run. I saw a lot of signs in the Bradley Center of no Bill Walton comments for NBC. But he was just a great ambassador for the game, and especially as he transitioned to doing the Pac-12 games on ESPN and his partnership with Dave Pass. They've put out quite a few videos chronicling that and some of the things that Bill would do, everything that he dealt with too, with the injuries and his quality of life in searching for treatment, but just his outlook to always treat each day as a blessing and lucky to have another one of them. And he also a big fan of the Grateful Dead. So one of my all-time favorites, and very, very much not as involved with the NBA anymore, more of a college guy, but still a very, very sad news to hear the passing of Bill Walton.
Yeah, he's a legend. He's a legend. What he did in college at UCLA, those teams were outstanding. He's one of my uncle's favorite players to talk about, especially just the way he played the center position. It was not seen somebody attack the game like Bill Walton did until Bill Walton did it. The injuries in the NBA level were unfortunate, but yet and still I was happy that he was able to, get the championship in Portland, that he was able to get a championship with the Celtics, because he was just a fun guy to watch. He was somebody who really operated by the beat of his own drum. And I love people like that. And I also love when you hear about, celebrities and basketball players, and what you hear taken away is that he was an even better person. Just on the court, great, outstanding. We saw that, but off the court, he was an even better person. And that's what I think about life, and what life really means is just the energy you bring into the room, how you treat people. And Bill Walton was one of those guys who brought a lot of love and a lot of light to every room that he walked in. So definitely sending out condolences to his family, his friends, all of his loved ones, the NBA community as a whole, losing another legend, because the NBA is still a relatively young league. A lot of the legends of this sport are still alive. And as we start seeing some of these guys pass, it just puts in retrospect and just keeps things in perspective of how fleeting life can be, as well as just remembering to try to give guys their flowers while they're here to receive them.
Yeah, you think about Bill Walton and Arvydas Sabonis as two guys
Mhm.
that we never really got to see fully revolutionize the game because of injuries. Arvydas, we didn't see it at the NBA level because by the time he came over to the Blazers, pretty advanced in age, and those knee injuries had piled up. But those are two very, very special players. And also, unfortunately, the season comes to an end for the Indiana Pacers. I know we were all saddened to see the Pacers come up short in the conference finals. It was kind of one of those memes brought to real life where you're thinking, I'd like to see the Pacers lose. It means the Celtics are going to win. But I think the solace, as we've seen a few comments here as well, is, hey, Drew Holiday's getting back to the finals. So congrats to Drew Holiday. Nobody else on the Celtics I'm going to wish congratulations to, but congrats to Drew Holiday. And man, you hate to see the Pacers come up short. Real bummer that they experienced injuries during the postseason.
Yeah, very much so. But hey, we might get 2 sweeps here in the conference finals, and then just have
first time that would have ever happened. Can you believe that?
And just wait until June 6th for the finals to start.
Yeah. Well, we could have a lot of waiting here. So in terms of taking a look at the finals and how do the Bucks stack up against these teams, we may have to wait quite a bit to get into that. But as we just went over, a lot coming up yet this week. It starts tomorrow with Gabe Stoltz, and then we'll take a look back at Brooke Lopez on Thursday, and still have some time to cast your vote for this week's Flashback Friday. But it seems like there's a lot of interest in the Brandon Jennings trade that brought the Bucks Brandon Knight and Chris Middleton. For Camille, I'm Justin. We thank you for tuning in and listening to Locked On Bucks once again. We'll talk to you tomorrow.